and your evaluations. And so as, you know, if you have time in the back of the chairs, there are instructions for an app for your phones. Definitely, you know, give us some feedback because it definitely fuels the presentations that we try to put together on these conferences. Okay, if you want to go ahead and make your way, we're going to start in about half a minute. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. Bernadine Strick from OSU and speaking today on cultural management decisions for sustainable yield and quality of blueberry, considering costs. So thank you.
Thank you. Is that loud enough? Loud enough? What? A little louder? Seriously? Is it on? Is it on? Seems like it's on, but I'm going to have to. God, I hate having this thing right here. Can we turn it up a little bit more? All right, let me set my timer. Oh, thank you. That's good. All right, so this is a big topic, and when I actually gave Chris Benedict the title, and I want to thank the organizing team for setting up such a great conference, and I really appreciate always being invited out here. I'm so glad I could be out here. So when I gave Chris this title, I thought I had more time than I have now. I'm not going to go long. That's not what I'm implying, but this is a really meaty topic. So what I'm going to do is highlight key areas that I think are important and list the areas that I think are important, but then focus on some key ones, particularly those that relate to current research that we've published. So let's start with the keys to maximum yield, yield potential at least, and then quality fruit. So what are the things that I think come to mind? Well, first of all, we have to have good plant growth and good flower bud set or fruit bud set. We have to have both to have good yield potential. And I'm going to focus a lot on each of these areas in subsequent slides. We need to have good fruit set and good seed set, particularly in many cultivars where a lot of seeds are needed for maximum berry size. So I'm going to focus quite a bit on that. Then we have to have the maximize the amount of harvestable high quality fruit that we have. And what defines that quality depends on your market and depends on what the packer or processor is wanting. And then we have to have cost-efficient production systems and harvest efficiency. The cost to pick a kilo or a pound of berries can be very much affected by your production system and these factors. So we're going to talk about that. And for me, cost efficient is really important. It's no use having 10% higher yield if it costs you 25% more money to get there, the equivalent. So that's really important to me and always has been important. So let's start with this first key, good plant growth and flower bud set. So the first thing that I think is critical that I'm not going to be talking anymore about is drainage problems. Blueberries are very sensitive to having their roots in waterlogged soil during the growing season in particular. They will not grow as well, and this will really reduce your yield. So if that wasn't fixed before planting, which is ideal, it certainly should be addressed very quickly. Secondly, something I'll talk a bit more about is managing weeds in the row. So often it's underestimated how much yield reduction there is when there's weed competition in the row. Good studies that have been done indicates that it could be as much as a 30% reduction in yield when you have weeds competing with the plants in the row. Also, that microclimate there under the row, it's higher humidity. SWD doesn't feel a need to leave the field, it stays in the field. And so managing SWD becomes more difficult also when we have situations like this, where we have weeds present in the row. So that needs to be addressed. Our options that are most practical include an organic type of mulch, sawdust, wood chips, and also weed mat, a porous polyethylene woven ground cover, which I'm going to call weed mat. So we've done quite a bit of research on comparing mulches. This was done over a 10-year study in certified organic, happened to be. And so in the graph, you can see 3 mulches shown there and their yield increasing from the first year of growth was 2007 through maturity, 2016 shown there. Duke and Liberty are average, just showing the 3 mulches for the different fertilizers. We have weed mat, sawdust was the industry standard when we started, and we have a yard debris compost topped with sawdust. And in 5 of the 9 fruiting years, we had a significant increase in yield, 8 to 20%, depending on combinations with fertilizer and cultivar. In fact, what was interesting was that Duke didn't really care what mulch we had in this system. Now, in all of these mulches, weeds were controlled, so we're seeing an effect of the mulch in itself without worrying about weeds confounding the results. But Liberty did particularly well with weed mat mulch. So these are advantages. We either have a similar yield and we could potentially have a higher yield even if we control weeds in all of those mulches. But we have lower weed management costs, particularly in organic. But if we ran the numbers on labor of herbicide application, the potential for phytotoxicity, we can run into issues with conventional comparisons also, hand pulling in the crown area, etc. So we have lower weed management costs, and I'll specifically show you how much in a bit. So those are 2 big advantages of weed mat, but we have disadvantages. The first is those darn voles are more prevalent under weed mat where they're protected from predators. And in organic production, they're very difficult to control unless you're a snake wrangler and want to throw those under there. But we open them up in the winter so the predators can get at them. We also found that plants grown with weed mat had a higher irrigation requirement in our climate in the Willamette Valley than did those grown with sawdust mulch. 50% greater irrigation requirement is a significant disadvantage of weed mat, the way we were testing it. In addition, we found higher soil temperature under weed mat, particularly close to the surface, up to 5 centimeters deep. And that higher temperature altered the canopy size and the growth and the root system size. that had a positive effect on yield and canopy size, likely affected irrigation, but that higher soil temperature also reduced soil organic matter over time. So if you look at this table here, this is an average over the last 5 years of the study, and we had significantly lower soil organic matter under weed mat than under sawdust. And while this didn't reduce yield, in fact, we still had same or higher yield, remember, with weed mat, in a long-term planting, as we hope with blueberry, a continued decline in soil organic matter under weed mat would be a concern. Because blueberries like higher organic matter, and there's lots of other benefits to that. So that raised a bit of a flag for us. So here's some data we have on weed management costs. Now, we did control the weeds. This happens to be a photo that I took right before we hand pulled these weeds. This yard debris compost with sawdust on top didn't work well for us because the sawdust sloughed off, it blew off. When you're pulling weeds, you raise that nutrient-rich moisture compost to the surface, and when a weed seed blows in, it germinates very readily. The compost itself was free of weed seeds. So there was more weed pressure in that mulch. Sawdust was much better than the compost plus sawdust, but by far the most economical method of weed control was the weed mat. The costs that are shown there are total cumulative costs from 2006 through 2014 per acre, including installation, material cost, and replenishment, including replacing the weed mat once during the study period and replenishing the sawdust every few years. And you can see we're at about half the cost managing weeds in organic systems with weed mat than with sawdust. So that's a big advantage. In guard rows, I thought, well, I'm expecting organic matter to go down under weed mats. So what I'm going to do is think of maybe a sawdust sandwich will work. So we have about 10 years of data growing 10 different blueberry cultivars in organic production with sawdust first, topped with weed mat, drip irrigation underneath. And that looked really promising for all the cultivars. And so that led to a study that's in progress now. Oh, I'm already speaking to my Canadian roots and saying progress instead of progress. See how fast that happens? So what we're looking at is Duke. This is Duke in its second growing season. We're harvesting it for the first time in this photo. We harvested the third growing season this past year. And we're looking at black weed mat alone, green weed mat alone compared to sawdust by itself. And then a sandwich of sawdust topped with weed mat, both black and green. And what we're finding is that we are seeing better root growth under the weed mat with sawdust and bigger canopies. And that led to higher yield in the second year of this study, with Duke being fertigated conventional production. So this looks really promising. We're also have dug plants up at the end of the first growing season, at the end of the second growing season, which was the beginning of this growing season. Looking at the weight of the root system, here I'm also measuring the size of the root system, and we're also looking at nutrient uptake so that we can learn more about what's the impact. Is there a cost, because it's expensive, you're putting down 2 mulches, so is there a good benefit to you if you're doing that? One of the things that I'm doing in the winter, I look and rate vole presence. And I'm pleasantly surprised to see that vole presence is lower in our sawdust plots than in our weed mat alone. And adding sawdust underneath seems to be a decent cultural way to minimize vole presence. They don't seem to like running under there as much when there's sawdust present. So that might be an added benefit. So I've talked about these top 2. So the next thing I want to mention is pruning well. And I can't stress, I don't have time to do a pruning class here today, but boy, the biggest impacts that I see, and you're going to hear me allude to pruning as I go through this presentation, is that pruning has a tremendous impact on how quickly you bring plants into production so that you're building canopy and getting to full production as soon as possible. And in mature plants that you're pruning well enough that you get that good balance, not just of good fruit development and good high quality yield, but you're also leading to good flower bud set. And pruning has a big impact on that. And here I was giving a pruning workshop very recently in Prosser, and the BC Blueberry Council has sponsored me. That's what I'm doing tomorrow, rain or shine. The next one I want to talk about is fertility management, and I'm going to throw pH into this because I've seen more problems with getting good plant growth and good fruit bud set when pH is either too low or too high. And some varieties are much more sensitive to this than others. So we have to maintain that, measure that, maintain it, because once you go low, it's very difficult to bring pH back up. So don't let it go too low. We want to also fertilize well to ensure that plants stop growing in time for good flower and fruit bud set, and that there aren't any imbalances in nutrients that will reduce your yield or quality. So those are the two things I'm going to focus on right now based on our research. So here's an example of a grower that has fertilized in a less than ideal manner. And this is in late September. They have late flushes of growth occurring because there's too much nitrogen available to the plants. And this leads to very poor fruit bud set. This is what we want to see, not poor fruit bud set. So your yield potential is already down when you're in this kind of a situation. So let me just allude to things. Fertilizer can be relatively inexpensive in conventional production. That's not the case in organic, but in conventional it certainly is. So we did a long-term study on Elliott. We had a low, medium, and a high fertilizer rate. Of course, there's a variation there in the amount because we start with a lower rate when plants are young, and then we increase it as plants age. So the upper number there, let's say 50, 150, and 240 pounds of nitrogen per acre are when the plants are mature. And the medium is about where our recommendations are, even with sawdust mulch for our soils in Oregon. Urea or ammonium sulfate was the source depending on the year and the pH. So here's what we found. Nothing. No effect on yield or quality in any year or cumulative. Think about that. We have a difference of 50 pounds to 240 pounds with sawdust mulch or no sawdust mulch. What does it tell us? 50 wasn't low enough to show an effect. So think about that. These plants do not need much nitrogen. Even in our low organic matter soils, they do not need much nitrogen. So higher rates of nitrogen had a negative effect. They decreased soil pH faster than the low rate of nitrogen, considerably faster, 4 times as fast. And there's a much higher cost associated with fertilizing with high rates of product. And we've done something similar in organic production systems, certified organic. We've used 2 sources of nitrogen, fish solubles, which we fertigated, and feather meal, which was applied as a granular product in a split application on top of the organic mulches or under the weed mat, and then the weed mat was closed. We have our low rate starting at 25 pounds when plants were young, increasing to 50 pounds when they were mature, and we have our high rate being about a little bit more than double that. So what did we find? So this graph shows the cumulative yield from the second growing season through maturity in 2016, well into maturity. The yellow or orange bars are Liberty, and the white bars are Duke. So when we average over the cultivars and over the fertilizer sources, this was significant. We had a significantly higher yield at the low rate than the high rate, 4% higher. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. At the low rate, our low rate is 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So unlike conventional where that was the same as higher rates, in this case, it's the best, has a higher yield. Also, when you think about we added nitrogen through a slow release compost, that added nitrogen did not further increase yield. We had more than enough at 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So keep that in your mind. Secondly, we had averaged over cultivar a 10% greater cumulative yield with feather meal than with fish. Why was that? Because there was relatively little fertilizer effect in Liberty. Notice how the orange bars, Liberty's yield is the same, cumulative yield, whether we fertilize with fish or feather, low or high. It doesn't care. So what do you do as a grower? Go with the cheapest product and the lowest rate, because in organic production, that saves you a lot of money. Duke, however, had 35% lower yield when we fertilized with fish than with feather. I'd hate to put, personalities on plants, but Duke just simply doesn't like fish. It's a vegetarian, perhaps. I don't know. But Duke is sensitive to fish. It's not because of salt. We measured that. It's not because of pH. There was no problem with pH. pH was at the correct level in all of our treatments. So why might that be? The important thing is that keeping this in mind from a cost perspective, we're looking at feather being half the cost of fish at a given rate. And if we can further reduce what growers are applying by half, that saves you a tremendous amount of money, because if you went at a half rate of feather at $430 an acre, instead of what growers tended to be doing, which was applying $1,700 worth of fish was the standard when I started this study, that's a huge savings. So that's made a big difference to many organic growers. So let's look a bit more and try and get at why might Duke be sensitive to fish? So when we have organic fertilizer products, many contain other nutrients. So even if you don't need them in your farm, you're applying more than just nitrogen. You can find products that are just nitrogen, but anyway, a lot of the sources have more than that. So if we look at feather meal and look at the nutrients that are being applied, yes, we have our low and our high rate of nitrogen. It's very similar to pounds per acre. And we're also applying calcium. So there's quite a bit of calcium. It's not a huge amount, but over time this adds up over the life of a planting. Whereas in fish, not only are we applying nitrogen, we're applying phosphorus and potassium as we apply that product. So when you think about doing that every year for 10 years of this study, that's pretty significant. So what we found was a pretty dramatic relationship between yield and leaf potassium. So first of all, we were able to document that the plants, particularly Duke, was taking up potassium. If we were applying it as part of a compost, or if we were applying it as part of a fish fertigation program, it was available to Duke plants in particular, and they took it up. Duke had higher leaf potassium than Liberty. So it took it up. That led to, in 4 of our 9 fruiting years, there was a strong negative relationship between leaf potassium level and yield. So the more potassium the plant took up, the lower the yield. In Liberty, we only had a negative relationship in 1 year, and there was a positive relationship in 2 of the 9 years. So not much there for Liberty. Also, what we found was that leaf potassium was negatively correlated with leaf calcium and leaf magnesium. So we're creating imbalances in the system. And those then would be the opposite, positively correlated with yield. And what's interesting is we found that feather meal was a good source of calcium. Amazing. You're applying it as a granular product. We do that with lime too, but for whatever reason, the calcium in feather meal was more available than it would be if it were applied as a lime. And we increase leaf calcium levels with feather meal and fruit calcium. So keep in mind that in Duke, when we had high leaf potassium, we also had low fruit calcium. So that's a negative implication on quality. And these are things you have to think about. And I'm showing you this, even if you're not an organic grower, I'd be really cautious about applying more potassium than plants need. Okay, Keep good weather records and count flower buds or fruit buds set in late winter. You need to know what's happening and be able to look for changes over time, particularly as climate change. So now let's talk about good fruit set and seed set. So be aware of weather impacts on bloom. So when we have very cold winters, you have a very concentrated bloom period. Why is that important? It's important because it's a much narrower window to get good fruit set. And you need to be aware of that. That's a much narrower, much more risk for getting enough bee activity. And you may need to increase hive density when you have a situation like that. And I think this past year was probably a good example of that up here. So keep weather records, count and calculate fruit bud set, and be aware that cultivars differ in their sensitivity to poor pollination. You can see on a particular variety good fruit set like here, but here's the same variety in a bad fruit set year. It can be very dramatic. So fruit set, just tag, always count the same bud from the tip of a fruiting lateral, count the number of flowers, count the number of berries, and calculate fruit bud set. No, pardon me, fruit set, how many flowers become berries. Be aware that fruit set is affected by how many times does a bee visit the flower, the flower shape, because some cultivars have flowers that are less desirable in shape for a honeybee in particular. How much nectar does the flower produce? Are there micronutrient deficiencies that can limit pollen tube growth and germination? The weather during bloom can have an adverse effect on pollen germination, pollen tube growth rate. The ovules may not be fertilized as quickly because it's either too cool or too hot, and too much rain can not only hamper bee activity, but it can hamper fruit set. So there's so many things. But what a lot of growers also seem to forget is that resource limitation can limit fruit set. Let me show you an example of that. The Aurora plant on the left was pruned quite lightly and has a lot of flowers. The one on the right has a much more good balance of flowering and leaf growth. The plant on the right, which is more balanced pruned, will have a higher percent fruit set, and it will have bigger berries. So while it has fewer flowers, it will have higher percent fruit set and bigger fruit, compensating a considerable amount for the lower fruit set that will occur on the plant on the left, but there are more flowers. So resource limitation, how many resources the plant has, it has too many flowers, it won't have as good a fruit set. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Cultivars also differ in their sensitivity. So here we have Megas Blue, which can have some fruit set issues in some years. And of course, Liberty. And what's interesting here is we had good flowering conditions for the flower clusters, which were at the tip of this lateral. But down here, the flowers that open later, the weather was less conducive to good fruit set, and we see poorer fruit set. And in many cultivars, it'll look like you've got berries there, and they will drop very early, different than the Draper drop, but they just drop because there aren't enough seeds potentially in those berries. So watch for that. So seed set is the proportion of ovules in the female part of the flower, the pistil, that become seeds. And it's affected by the exact same conditions that I just talked about for fruit set. And cultivar differences are very common. So I really encourage growers to walk through the field and just open up berries and look for how many seeds do you have in there, and get used to, is that good for that cultivar, or is that lower than normal? And why might that be? How can I fix that? We did a study looking at 9 different cultivars in the Willamette Valley over 2 years, and I just published this, and I wanted to share some of the data with you. So I found a positive relationship between the seeds per berry and berry weight in all cultivars except our problem child Draper, which had no relationship in 1 year and a kind of weak relationship in the other year, and I'll show you pictures. So here we have 2 graphs, Draper and Duke. So you'll notice that there's a pretty tight, good relationship here in the Duke. we can see that when we have as many as 70, 80 seeds per berry, we, from 60 to 80, we have the biggest fruit, 3.5, 4 grams, nice berry size in Duke. And we can also see that we can get parthenocarpic fruit, fruit that develops to a commercial size with either no seeds or very few seeds. And that's good. That's an advantage to you as a grower. In contrast, Draper has a very poor relationship between seed number. Let me show you an example. Here we have berry that has 30 seeds, and they can go anywhere from a half gram, which is not very big, needless to say, for commercial size, all the way up to a 4-gram berry. That's a poor relationship between seed number and berry weight in that cultivar, and it's much more difficult to predict how it will respond to good fruit set conditions. Another couple of examples, nice tight relationships between seeds per berry and berry size in Aurora and in Liberty. And in both of those cultivars, we get good parthenocarpic fruit development with relatively few seeds. So even with, situations of poor potential pollination, you might expect a decent crop. Not as good a crop as you would otherwise have, but still a decent crop. So we have to have good pollination conditions, not just to get a maximum number of berries, but also to get maximum berry size. So don't skimp on that. Make sure hives are strong and put them in. And many cultivars, including blue crop, need a decent number of berries, seeds per berry to get a decent berry size. And if you want to look at the other cultivars that we studied, you let me know and you can access the paper. To maximize harvestable high quality fruit, we have to monitor the weather, have good disease control to retain the flowers and the fruit, needless to say. We need to be aware of any cultivar differences and fertilizer requirements to reduce fruit drop in sensitive cultivars and maximize berry weight. We have to have good insect management to minimize risk of downgraded fruit or rejection to SWD. And we have to minimize bird depredation or other losses like that. For cost-efficient production systems and good harvest efficiency, we have to manage the field to address critical factors to maximize yield. We can prioritize when we have to save costs or maximize returns, but be careful and look at the cost-benefit analysis. I often hear of reducing pruning costs. That'll save me a lot of money, but then look at the negative effects of that. When you're hand picking, larger fruit costs less to pick. And what affects berry size? We have the cultivar, or the genetics is the main determinant, but within cultivar, pruning has a huge effect on berry size. Fruit set, seed set, I talked about those. Irrigation management can have a big effect, positive and negative, with too much or too little. Weather, climate, tunnel production, huge impacts on berry firmness, berry size, and you need to be aware of those. And fruit harvest frequency, what stage of berry development do you pick the fruit at? With machine or hand harvesting, the number of harvests, the number of times you have to go through the field to pick per cultivar affects the cost. So what affects that? The biggest effect on that is pruning. Pruning has a huge impact on the concentration of the fruiting season. If you don't prune well, you have to go through the field to pick more often, and that can have a huge cost. And how many days we have between each successive pick can impact your costs. So we looked at this for these cultivars, fruiting seasons, picking at a high, medium, or a low picking frequency. And needless to say, the fewer times you go through the field, if the fruit are bigger and you go through less frequently, that saves you in picking costs. Certainly when you're hand picking, but also when you're machine picking, you get lower costs. So I'm going to focus on a couple things on this big table and then rather show you the graphs. So what you see up on this table here is yield over 2 years. We see big differences between the cultivars. And I want to focus here on picking frequency. High frequency is picking every time the fruit first turns fully blue, so about every 4 days. medium's about every 7 days, and low is about picking every 12 days. And you can see we had no effect on yield. So that's a good thing. But berry weight over here is significantly larger, particularly when we compare a low frequency to a high. So we're getting bigger fruit, which is more efficient to hand pick at least. And firmness is something I always get asked about. So I'm going to just show you that in graphs, considering the time. So here's firmness. We have a high picking frequency in red, medium in yellow, and low picking every 12 days in green. And yes, if you pick fruit very frequently or when it's first fully blue and let's say a Duke to get that early fruit, it is firmer. But when we compare the medium and low, there's hardly any difference between firmness. The main determinant is cultivar. Draper's the firmest of this group. So that's interesting because that's a pretty big difference, a 5-day difference, picking every 7 days or 12 days. Soluble solids or bricks is much lower when we pick when first fully blue. And again, not a big difference between medium and low picking frequency. But acidity is also very high when we pick early. So if you're picking Duke when it is first fully blue, you're going to have smaller fruit, more acid, and lower sugar. And that leads to this, which is a poor perceived sweetness. So this is the sugar to acid ratio. The perceived quality of that fruit is much better when we pick less frequently. And that palatability is something very important. So we're not seeing a negative impact of reducing our picking frequency. So keep that in mind. So we have picking every 12 days instead of every 7. No effect on yield on firmness. We have higher berry weight, reduced acidity, increased bricks, and a better sugar to acid ratio in the cultivars that we looked at. So consider that as long as you keep in mind that that fruit is on your bushes longer, and that offers a risk to some losses like insect, birds. You have to manage it well. So look for those opportunities to save costs, but please don't always jump onto, I can just reduce pruning costs, because there are so many potential negative effects of that. So I wanted to leave time for questions. I think I did that.
I got one, Bernie.
Yes.
This is from a prosser. Observed any relationships between leaf area yield, fertility rate, and fertility source?
Any relationships between leaf area and yield?
Fertility rate and fertility source.
Fertility rate and all 4 of those together?
I'm not fully understanding.
Because I already talked about fertility rate and source, so
Exactly.
I'm a little confused by that part of the question. So the answer to fertility rate and source, yes, I have seen effects on quality, particularly yield, not so much berry size or firmness. So I think that gets at that part. On leaf area and yield, it is, even I don't put my students through getting leaf area off of bushes to get a leaf to fruit ratio, because there's a lot of leaves on a blueberry bush. But let me say this, when we don't prune hard, we get smaller fruit, not just because we are leaving a lot of fruit, but we also get a lower leaf to fruit ratio. So when we get a lower leaf to fruit ratio, we see a lower quality. We not only see smaller berry size, we see fewer seeds per berry, which is partly related to the size, and we see a lower bricks on when we're leaving a lower leaf to fruit ratio. I've seen that in many production systems. Yes.
So on your organic fertilization, you were showing the weed mat. It was fish meal comparative to fish emulsion through fertigation, and you're getting it was half the cost for the feather mill.
Yes.
What do you do for organic, where you have a weed mat? And I guess, so in relation, you'd have to pull your weed mat back. So taking that into account, how much it would cost per acre to do that in order to put the feather mill on?
It's a good question. I'll paraphrase that. So the question is, when we're looking at cost comparisons of comparing a feather meal or another soybean meal or something that we are needing to apply under weed mat if we have weed mat and the drip has to be underneath, then what about the cost of opening and closing a weed mat to be able to? So we had no problem fertigating fish, first of all, but I have to say you have to filter it many times, do a good job with that, or the emitters plug. But that's true of some other sources too. So good drip management adds a cost too when you use fish. But to put a granular product under the weed mat, some of that cost could, to be fair, could be mitigated by the fact that you need to open the weed mat anyway. You should be opening the weed mat to check your irrigation, to check your emitter flow. I would hope, would be putting some other products underneath that might be needed, like a gypsum or a granular boron. If you're not, it's hard to fertigate boron in organic. So there might be other reasons for vertebrate pest control, voles, and etc. So a lot of our organic growers, when they're opening, they're also doing something else, like they're adding an organic material every few years or something. But yes, it's a good point. Opening the weed mat does add a cost with a granular, but there are other liquid sources than fish available that are just nitrogen. And that's what we're doing now is we've switched to try and fix the problem of high potassium. We're now applying liquid products that we're fertigating under weed mat that have low potassium to see what changes is that affecting in plants that have for 10 years been fertilized with fish or feather. So very good point, looking at the whole system for costs.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.